I regret that the management has asked me to inform you that the individual just introduced by Deborah Winger will not be present today. He is preoccupied with preparing for the rapture and the second coming. When I was 8 years old in Oklahoma, my grandmother Ada said to me, "What are you going to be when you grow up, Bill?" And I said, "I just want to be introduced by Deborah Winger." She's happy wherever she is today. Thank you so much. You're as remarkable in person as you are on the screen. And thank you for that generous welcome. I was a broadcast journalist so long on air that I often heard when I spoke at an occasion like this, "He needs no introduction." Not so. A few years ago, I was sitting here at Union Station in Washington waiting for the train back to New York when a woman about my age came up and with a quizzical look on her face said, "Weren't you Bill Moyers?" True story. "Once upon a time," I answered. "I'll be damned," she said. "I didn't think you were still with us." "Well, I am," I said, and figuring her for a news junkie, I said, "Perhaps you've confused me with other broadcast journalists like David Brinkley or Howard K. Smith or Charles Kuralt or Paul Duke, also at PBS. All of them recently passed on," I told her. She clearly wasn't satisfied, and as she turned to walk away, she said over her shoulder, "Well, I always watched you when you were alive." So you can imagine how grateful I am still to be here, alive, and for sure in your company. When Jeff called to invite me to speak, I was deep into Lynn Siegel's latest book, Radical Happiness, Moments of Collective Joy. Siegel is the feminist Australian scholar now teaching at the University of London. She makes a passionate call for the rediscovery of the political. Living in a time of increasingly individualism, she says, we've never been more lonely or more miserable. What we need is what she calls transformative joy, the radical happiness that comes through solidarity. It is working with others for broad social change, she writes, that we find a deeper meaning to our existence. The philosopher Hannah Arendt makes this point. No one could be called happy or free without participating in and having a share of public power. And here's the statesman Edmund Burke on the importance of being together in a good cause. Quote, "Whilst people are linked together, they easily and speedily communicate the alarm of any evil design. They are enabled to fathom it with common counsel and to oppose it with united strength. Whereas when they lie dispersed without concert, order, or discipline, communication is uncertain, counsel difficult, and resistance impracticable. When the bad combines," he said, "the good must associate, else they will fall one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle." So you did a good thing, Jeff, in bringing us together to share the radical happiness of solidarity and sacrifice and commitment to a common cause that will create broad social change in America. I congratulate you, your team, and supporters for pulling it off. And I personally want to thank each one of you for your meticulous attention to detail, especially finding cabs as it began to rain last night. I confess to falling into melancholy funk, the slough of despair, as John Bunyan calls it in Pilgrim's Progress. Through most rough passages in my own life, I have remained resilient and hopeful, but I find it hard not to despair when my country is in trouble. These days, I keep remembering what a friend of mine on Wall Street said when I asked him what he felt about the market. He said, "I'm optimistic." Then I said, "Why do you look so worried?" And he said, "Because I'm not sure my optimism is justified." Nor am I. I'm still struggling as a journalist for the vocabulary to describe, much less explain, the alien strain that has flooded our body politic. It's homegrown, not foreign. It's human, not extraterrestrial. If Martians landed in Washington today, I suspect they would look about with alarm, scramble back into their spaceship, and head for home. Should Elon Musk follow them, I can imagine him encountering a great wall which the Martians have built and paid for themselves with blazing towers flashing, "Earthlings not welcome." So what you are doing is so important, and I came to thank you for not giving up. It is the fight of our lives because the Republic is fighting for its life. Mary Oliver got it right in one of her great poems, which you made me think of, Deborah. We will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, she wrote, that tried to banish insecurity for the few and cared little for the penury of the many. We will be known as a culture that taught and rewarded the amassing of things, that spoke little, if at all, about the quality of life for people, other people, for dogs, for rivers. All the world in our eyes, they will say one day, was a commodity. And they will say that this structure was held together politically, which it was. And they will also say that our politics was no more than an apparatus to accommodate the feelings of the heart, and the head in those days was small and hard and full of meanness. What you are doing is crucial. If you have time for only one book this political season, I have the one for you. Beautiful Country, Burn Again, coming out in August. The author, Ben Fountain, also wrote a marvelous best-selling novel called Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. I urge you to read that too. This new one is the boldest, the bravest, and the most bracing book I have read about the politics of this era, from the years leading up to the election of 2016 through the spectacle since 2016. If you want to understand how we got to such vast income inequality, to stagnant wages, to offshoring millions of American jobs, to the mass concentration of wealth, and to Donald Trump, read Beautiful Country, Burn Again, written with vivid, compelling, memorable, and vital language like the best novelists can create. He writes, "We could vote, hold marches, post our views on Facebook and Twitter, join movements, sign petitions, support this or that candidate. It hardly mattered. Something had gone wrong with the American democracy. Or rather, what was happening only looked like democracy, but in fact was something different altogether." He takes on the American schizophrenia and lays out the truth about our mangled politics and the great lie that torments our soul. that we still believe in the dogma of democracy at some superficial level, but have given up on it privately. The vast majority of Americans have lost meaningful agency over their lives. We still, he writes, have our political rights to vote, to assemble, to speak freely, and so forth, but real power lies elsewhere. Democracy had become a privileged domain operating in favor of those with significant resources. And while we still call ourselves a democracy, in fact, we are at the mercy of oligarchs and plutocrats, hedge fund managers and private equity owners, corporate boards and CEOs, hired mercenaries of propaganda, public relations, and political strategy, and a handful of mighty conglomerates owned by 15 billionaires, all of whom are dedicated to reporting everything except reality in America, especially the reality of power, how it works, who wins, and who loses. For the moral compact to form a more perfect union for what Abraham Lincoln called the voluntary public good, the general welfare, this alliance of capital and political power has established Ayn Rand's philosophy of ethical egoism, which holds that the morally correct action in any situation is the one that advances your self-interest. The multi-billionaire hedge fund owner Ray Dalio, who could well be Ayn Rand's spiritual godson, is their evangelist. His gospel of warmed-over social Darwinism preaches that laissez-faire capitalism is the natural order. If you want to improve society, says Ray Dalio, turn loose the hyenas. Listen, quote, when a pack of hyenas takes down a young wildebeest, is this good or bad? At face value, this seems terrible. The poor wildebeest suffers and dies. Some people might even say that hyenas are evil. Yet this type of apparently evil behavior exists throughout nature in all species. Like death itself, this behavior is integral to the enormously complex and efficient system that has worked for so long as there's been life. I'm still quoting. It is good for both the hyenas, who are operating in their self-interest, and the interest of the greater system, which includes the wildebeest, because killing and eating the wildebeest fosters evolution. That is the natural process of improvement. The natural process of improvement. Still quoting, like the hyenas attacking the wildebeest, successful people, like himself, may not even know if or how their pursuit of self-interest helps evolution, but it typically does. I don't know what the wildebeest would say about that if it were still around, but that is the philosophy that has come in the last 50 years to penetrate, dominate, and drive the American economic system. Our two-legged hyenas loathe the institutions and social structures that are at work, that are the work of well-governing structures and social norms. After all, they can buy what they need: health care, clean water, political clout. Bloomberg News reported the other day on the new fad among the ultra-rich to engage their bored 8-year-olds with birthday parties in private jet services with a minimum cost for 2 hours of $28,000. Prices for longer parties can top 6 figures, while children are caged on the border. Half a century ago, this predatory alliance of capital and power set out to remake America in their image. No more regulations, no more labor unions, no more minimum wage, no more taxes. They wanted nothing to do with democracy that they couldn't buy. Newt Gingrich challenged Republicans that to ultimately succeed, you almost had to destroy the system so that you could rebuild it. This war, said Gingrich, has to be fought with a scale and a duration and a savagery that is only true of civil wars. Democrats, meanwhile, pulled up their roots on Main Street and repotted them in rows along the windowsills of Wall Street. They bought the argument of big money donors that the government's highest purpose is to act as a clearinghouse for global commerce. They and the Republicans colluded in dismantling the mixed economy that since the New Deal has produced a broadly shared prosperity and a stable middle class. After all, weren't out of work and poorly paid losers merely the casualties of free trade and new technology, the wildebeests of the economy? I knew the party of Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson was in trouble when a former chief of staff to Bill Clinton described Social Security as a milk cow with 310 million tits. And Clinton himself allowed himself to be conned by piggish Wall Street plutocrats, Hamiltonian Democrats they called themselves, into dismantling the very safeguards against reckless speculation that during the 70 years since the Great Depression had prevented another crash. Over the past 50 years, both parties sold out the American people and put democracy on the auction block. Did you know there is not one U.S. state, metro population, or county which someone working a 40-hour week on a federal minimum wage of $7.25 can afford to rent a modest two-bedroom apartment? Minimum wage workers would need to work a 122-hour week to hold down 3 full-time jobs and make enough to rent that apartment. Did you know that the Centers for Disease Control reports our infant mortality is higher than that of any other 27 wealthy countries? Did you know that healthcare spending levels our healthcare spending levels are significantly higher in any other country in the world? And that a baby born in the United States is less likely to reach its first birthday than in Hungary, Poland, or Yugoslavia? Or for Cuba, for that matter? Do you know that UNICEF has found that America is near the bottom of 41 countries when it comes to meeting goals on child poverty, hunger, health, and education? This isn't the speech I intended to make. But on Thursday, a new Rasmussen survey was published that finds democracies worldwide are experiencing a crisis of trust. Democratic systems of government, and I'm quoting, are under severe threat, it reports, not only from foreign interferences and the rise of autocratic regimes, but also from the huge crisis of confidence among the electorate. In fact, Freedom House's latest index finds that people living in nations called democratic have even less faith in government than those living in non-democratic states. More than half of the respondents in democratic countries said their voices rarely or never matter in politics. And 64% said they believe their government rarely or never acts in the interest of the public. On the train down here, I read in the summer edition of the American Scholar the historian John Lucat's essay. He writes that the great age of the past 500 years, the modern age, is over. Its chief feature, he said, was the rise of democracy, defined by Lucas as the rule of majorities instead of minorities, perhaps for the first time in the history of humanity. Although the word existed in ancient Greece, in the past 2,000 years, democracy had been put into practice only here and there during short episodes. When the brilliant young Frenchman de Tocqueville came to America and famously toured the nascent United States in the 1830s, what he saw happening here, Lucas writes, was more important than the French Revolution, maybe even more important than the Enlightenment, because democracy, he said, went beyond politics to engage the lives of entire peoples. The great movement of history to Tocqueville, says Lucas, was the transformation from an aristocratic to a democratic age, and he said it was monumental and irreversible. Monumental, to be sure. Irreversible, not so sure. If only Tocqueville had come to America just 7 years earlier, he could have called on John and Abigail Adams and debated the matter with them. Adams, who signed the Declaration of Independence and went on to become our second president, was a student of history, particularly tragic history. He saw that what can be gained can just as easily be lost. And in a letter to Abigail, he wrote, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." He said on the average, democracy survived 250 years. So subtract 1776 or 1789, depending on your point of view, your vantage point, from 2018 and see where we are on the timetable. Now, why? Why did he think that democracy was as likely as aristocracy and monarchy to go into the dustbin of history? Because, said John Adams, and this is seldom quoted in his commentaries on democracy, because he said democracy is, quote, no less vain, no less proud, no less selfish, no less ambitious, or no less avaricious than they are. These passions, he said, are the same in all men, under all forms of simple government, and when unchecked, produce the same effects of fraud, violence, and cruelty as aristocracy and monarchy. When clear prospects are opened before vanity, pride, avarice, or ambition for their easy gratification, it is hard for the most considerate philosophers and the most conscientious moralists to resist the temptation. Individuals have conquered themselves, said John Adams. Nations and large bodies of men, never. Friedrich Nietzsche would later echo Adams, writing, "Insanity in individuals is somewhat rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule," which is why the founders built into our Constitution the checks and balances, including the defense against inordinate wealth, that they knew would appeal even to small d Democrats. Dr. Alan Francis picks up on that observation to publish a new book, which I heartily recommend to you, with the title, Twilight of American Sanity. He's professor emeritus and former chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavior at Duke University in North Carolina, a serious man. He frames in context the clear and present danger that we face as a country gripped by delusion and blind, quote, to challenges posed by inequality, technological displacement, global warming, resource degradation, and overpopulation. Threats, he said, that could doom the future. So why are we here? What brought us to this moment of radical happiness together? Because this is the cause that affects all other causes. A government that cannot stand up to vested interests cannot take on these deadly threats. It will have no legitimacy with the mass of people. We can't save democracy without representative government. And we can't have representative government if the moneyed interests keep sabotaging our elections. So you are fighting for the third emancipation in American history. The first emancipated slaves from bondage. The second emancipated African Americans from the tyranny of a Jim Crow noose and Jim Crow laws. And now the third great emancipation is to free our democracy from the grip of big money. Yes, as my friend, the historian Julie Pacior says, and she's here today, the odds are great. Yes, powerful forces are against you. Yes, it's a complex issue, even wonky. Yes, it has no charismatic leader like Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, it lacks the drama to attract the media like the March on Selma. And yes, there's almost nothing harder in the democracy movement. And believe me, it takes a democracy movement if we're going to save our representative government. There's almost nothing harder than trying to enact a constitutional amendment. But not all, by the way. Be sure to read The Woman's Hour. It's a new book, a magnificent, rollicking book by Elaine Weiss about the suffragettes who descended on Nashville, Tennessee in July 1920 for the climactic battle of the decades-long struggle to win the vote for women. The review by Fergus Bordewich in today's Wall Street Journal is wonderful, too. Among the suffragettes, and get this for your movement, were Democrats and Republicans, radicals and conservatives, rabble-rousers and club women, the flamboyant and the staid, bound together in the radical happiness of trying to change this country, though not always amicably. They came to lobby the Tennessee legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment. Did they do it? 2 years ago, 73 million women cast votes for the President of the United States. They did it. Against all the odds. Against thousands of years of male patriarchy. They did it. And you can do it too. Now hear this before I close. Listen closely. For the first time in our history, and again, Julie is my source, a fine historian. For the first time in history, a social movement has the majority of Americans behind it from the outset. Nearly all Americans, including a large majority of Republicans, favor this cause. So the person you will be trying to recruit is likely already to be on your side. So let me end by reminding you of a story so familiar it's become almost a cliche. It's my friend, the historian Bernie Weisberger's favorite story, and he's a great 95-year-old historian of the progressive movement. The Constitutional Convention has just wrapped up its work in September of 1787. No details have yet been made public. As Benjamin Franklin leaves Federal Hall, a woman stops and asks him, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" And Benjamin Franklin answers, "A republic if you can keep it. Now I want to ask all of you to stand. Would you just stand right there where you're seated? Stand. Look at the palm of your hands. The palm of your hands. Did you ever imagine so great a task would be placed in your hands? And I want you to turn and shake hands with the person to your left and to the right. Go ahead, to the left and to the right. And I want you to say, we can do it. Say it louder. We can do it. We can do it. And we will do it. We will do it. We will do it.